you to the Greater Caribbean Center Brown Bag series, right? Two very appropriate speakers today. Maja is an associate professor of in the Latin American and Spanish cultures department at Barnard College. She's an expert in Caribbean history and politics and cultures. Has worked a lot on gender, sexuality. Has a beautiful book on masculinity in the Dominican Republic since Trujillo. And it's going to talk about today about queer studies in the Caribbean after Orlando, which most people don't know that, but a lot of the people who died in Orlando were actually Latinos, and disproportionately not so much Mexicans, but Puerto Ricans. Orlando is a big center of Puerto Rican migration. And then Alberto Medina is going to be the discussant, and very appropriately so, he's also a professor of, in the department of, this one is Latin American and Iberians. Culture, yeah. It's the same, except that you don't do Portugal. You're not Iberian. No, you're Iberian. You're Hispanocentric. You could say Spanish and Lusitanian cultures, you know.
We don't teach
I know, for the future. And he has worked on political culture in the 18th century, Spain, also transatlantic flows of culture and ideas, contemporary Spanish literature and film, and also, and that's why he's here also, on sexuality and actually queer studies. That's a more recent element in your work, I think. No? Yeah. And so he will be the discussant after Maja gives us her insights. So thanks to both of you.
All right. Well, thank you to Jose for inviting me, and I'm glad I finally made it. And thank you to Alberto for being willing to read my work and for responding to it. So I will be presenting on a newer project, and so it's still, it's being developed as this semester, next semester specifically, so I'm really grateful for any insights you might have for future directions. So, in the early hours of June 12, 2016, 49 people were shot and killed, and 53 people were wounded by a lone shooter in the gay club called Pulse in Orlando, Florida. It has been called, though it has also been debated, the deadliest mass shooting in modern U.S. history. That took place on the nightclub's Latin night, and most of the victims were Latinos and Latinas. More than half of them were Puerto Rican, and others were Cuban, Dominican, Colombian, Venezuelan, Mexican, and American, among others. So there was a large percentage of people of Caribbean descendants. In the wake of this tragedy, I returned to a scholarly project that I have put aside for a few years, a book on queer Dominican cultural expressions, to ask myself what my queer Dominican literature, visual arts, and performance have to offer, if anything, that might be relevant to understanding the Orlando tragedy and its larger implications. And more broadly, what may the growing field of queer Caribbean studies bring to the troublesome questions raised by the shooting. So to begin with, I want to note that despite it figuring in the title of my talk, there is actually no such thing as a unified field of queer Caribbean studies. For one, the usefulness of the term queer for the Caribbean is actually far from settled, and scholars analyzing Caribbean same-sex desires and non-heteronormative subjects tend to still weigh carefully the possibilities but also the limitations of using queer for talking about same-sex desire in the Caribbean. On one hand, there's the question of language. For the non-Anglophone Caribbean islands, given that queer is an English term, and, for example, the Puerto Rican scholar Lawrence LaFontaine Stokes, who writes on Puerto Rican queer cultures, does choose to employ the term queer, but always with a certain caveat. So I quote him, he himself is painfully aware of the bind or limitations of using queer or LGBT as stand-ins for practices, identities, and experiences that are much more complex and diffuse, especially since there's such vernacular specificities are captured in Spanish language words, but not in English. End of quote. Yet even scholars who focus more on the English-speaking Caribbean, such as Rosamund King, who was a professor at Brooklyn College here, have expressed reservations about the use of queer and have chosen terms such as sexual minority or phrases such as women who love women to talk about same-sex desire in the Caribbean. In a related vein, one can also question how far it is useful to think about the Caribbean as a geographical unit of analysis, given the notable historic, linguistic, and cultural differences of the region. Different European colonial legacies have resulted in a fracturing that persistently challenges the potential for cohesiveness in the region. So just for my case, that means that sometimes it's easier to dialogue with work on Latin American sexualities, because I work on the Dominican Republic in the Spanish-speaking Americas, rather than across the Caribbean in other regional contexts. So, however problematic the terms queer and Caribbean may be, I do use them here and in my project as a sort of shorthand for a growing body of scholarship that on non-heteronormative sexualities in the insular Caribbean, in part because there might not be an actually unified field of Caribbean queer studies, this scholarship does generally have certain shared concerns. This concern is, how does one account for local Caribbean expressions of same-sex desires and subjectivities that fall outside the language of LGBT politics and identity? This question in turn raises further difficult questions that each scholar has to grapple with, such as what is the relationship between such so-called local expressions of queer subjectivity and what are thought of as more globalized LGBT scripts? Is it an inherently antagonistic relation where local expressions are always under the threat of erasure by globalized LGBT politics and discourses? Or do these coexist readily side by side, or perhaps even reinforce each other in different and even productive ways? As most parts of the Caribbean now have local LGBT rights-focused organizations, it becomes increasingly tricky to suggest that these simply represent outside, foreign, or non-local forces. Without question, such globalized discourses of claiming rights and other strategies associated with LGBT politics have been gaining traction and currency in the Dominican Republic in the past decade, and they're contributing to changing the Dominican public sphere's relation to non-heteronormative sexuality. However, I emphasize that it's important to not solely attribute such changes to the relatively recent emergence of LGBT discourses and strategies of claiming rights, seeking visibility, and pursuing new forms of recognition in the 21st century. I would loosely, sort of this explosion of LGBT organizations in the Dominican Republic, I would date it around 2006. There were some before, but it vastly expanded since 2006. So that there are definitely around 10 now, and in 2006 there were more like two or three. So approaching Dominican expressions of same-sex desire only through this lens of LGBT organization or organizing politics runs the danger of erasing the vibrant queer cultural labor of Dominican artists, writers, and performers who have long before 2006 and long before the 21st century and the consolidation of LGBT organizations in Santo Domingo challenged gender and sexual norms in the Dominican national public sphere, and its prescription against public expressions of same-sex desire. This vibrant queer cultural scene has remained largely illegible to the outside world and mostly absent in scholarship. Note, for example, that while there are important scholarly monographs dedicated to queer Cuban and Puerto Rican cultures, such as Emilio Veje's Gay Cuban Nation and Lawrence LaFontaine Stokes' Queer Ricans, Dominican queer culture on the island has yet to receive this kind of scholarly attention. Key anthologies in Caribbean and Latin American sexuality studies have either completely omitted the Dominican Republic, and here I'm thinking of two anthologies, Hispanism and Homosexualities and Entiendes, that were published by Duke University Press in the 90s and were really path-breaking in the field of Latin American studies and Iberian studies as well. And they include actually quite a few essays about Puerto Rican and Cuban queer sexualities, but not a single essay on Dominican queer sexualities. Or what also has happened is that some of Caribbean anthologies have included questionable selections by heterosexual identified authors with no ties to local queer culture. And I say questionable because I would argue that they're actually kind of homophobic representation of transgender people rather than sort of queer-friendly representations. Hence, my book projects contest the ostensible absence of Dominican cultural representations of same-sex desiring subjects by highlighting writers, visual artists, and performers who, since the 1990s and long before the 21st century explosion of LGBT organizations, have represented these in their creative works. So importantly, these artists, writers, and performers are well known, and they are in no way marginal figures in the Dominican national cultural sphere. So, there's the writer Irma Contreras, who's on the left here, a writer who she's widely thought of to have written the first short story that features same-sex desire between women from a non-homophobic perspective. And she has a really interesting collection called Entre los Silencios, Between Two Silences. That's really important to my work. Then you have the visual artist and poet Nelson Guerrero, who is thought to have had the first very hugely popular exhibit in the Zona Colonial in Santo Domingo with very openly sort of, I wouldn't say homoerotic, but pictures that featured him and his partner very clearly together, such as this picture that was in the exhibit. I think that was 1998. Then he's also a poet, and he's published his poetry in the Dominican Republic, and it's very openly homoerotic, which is also the late 90s and earlier. So then the playwright and performer, actor, singer, Walis Hackes, who has at least 6 or 7 plays that he wrote and showed in the Dominican Republic. Including a play that many plays that have characters that are either transgender or openly homosexual, and that he staged long before. So this is from 2005. So he staged these very openly queer characters, long before sort of this eruption of LGBT discourse. And then we have the writer and musician Vitaliana Hernandez. She became really popular as a musician in 2011, but she was actually really well known as a writer in the country starting in the late, around 1998, 1999. So she has a little work that deals with same-sex desire in her earlier novels, in particular from 2000 to 2003, where she talks about same-sex desire between women. So there are some others that I include in my book. I won't show here, but these are not the only people, but these are some of the key figures, and I'm showing them because these are really well-known national figures. So I'm not talking about people who are sort of very on the margins, sort of have shown their work, but these are all cultural actors whose work have won like the nationally really, really important prizes in literature, in the visual arts, and in writing, like basically most important national prizes. So these are not widely recognized people. What this highly diverse group with its notable generational, class, and racial differences shares is that they all have accumulated a certain cultural capital in the Dominican Republic. It is precisely their success with Dominican audiences and their national recognition that renders the question of how they stage, visualize, and spell out queer desires and subjects in their work, despite the manifold obstacles to making such desires public, so pertinent. I turn to their work to trace the inventive ways in which they employ conceptual and aesthetic tools to address queer Dominican desires and subjects, and their strategies not only for survival, but also at times for thriving in the Dominican Republic. These strategies are neither informed by globalized LGBT politics and sexual rights discourses, nor are they purely and sort of authentically local or traditional Dominican forms. Indeed, while these works are strongly informed by the local Dominican context, the writings, artworks, and musical and theatrical performances are in no way insular or purely local expressions. Not only have the artists, writers, and performers spent varying periods of time living abroad or still form part of the diaspora, as the case with Nelson Ricard and Italiana lives in Puerto Rico, their works are also avidly informed by outside repertoires as varied as French psychoanalytic thought and the language of Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous. At the same time, they're also certainly not foreign artists, given that they consistently return to produce queer artistic work at home in the Dominican Republic, where they continue to find some of their most important and numerous audiences. Hence, their practices and strategies confound the, at times, alternate division between diaspora and nation that is present in queer studies and elsewhere. These so-called queer homecomings, not only of Rita Indiana, but also Tilma Contreras, who used to live in France and returned to the Dominican Republic, Juarez Jaques, who sometimes lives in New York and travels back and forth, and Nelson Ricard Guerrero, question the prevalent narrative of queer Caribbean subjects having to go into what's called sexile to the US or elsewhere to lead productive and happy lives. Yet their queer returns also do not imply that they perceive the Dominican Republic as some kind of safe queer haven. Their creative works are in fact deeply critical of the conditions that shape queer lives in the Dominican Republic. However, they are not invested in answering to these constraints through the models of LGBT politics and strategies that they encounter in the presumably more progressive and liberal countries that they travel to or reside in. So I want to show you a video by Rita Indiana Hernandez. I think I would call this her kind of breakthrough video that became, I wouldn't say a national anthem in the Dominican Republic, but it was like really widely, really widely appreciated. And many, if you go to your concerts, people would sing it around along to the lyrics, in particular to the song. And I think a lot of you speak Spanish, and you can follow along. But for those if you don't, what the song is about is sort of a call for Dominican migrants to return to the Dominican Republic, after suffering for, hard work and cold in New York, to pack their bags and take what she calls una yola al revés, so sort of the boats that sometimes migrants flee in, to take it back to the Dominican Republic, and it's time, and there's a lot of other things going on in the lyrics. I have the lyrics if anyone is interested. So I just want to show you a little excerpt, I guess, to show you what I would, her kind of queer aesthetics that she combines with this very broad call to for Dominicans to come back. It's tongue in cheek,
No, there's no shade here. I tried
in my work, I actually analyze this, much more profoundly than I do here. But I'm showing this video in part because I was really interested in this, sort of what I argue like queer argument for returning to the Dominican Republic, which is very counterintuitive to some of the arguments that you see in queer diaspora studies. Kind of suggest how queer subjects are leaving the Caribbean and have to move to like the U.S. or Europe to have, happier and better lives. And so she's one of the artists that I look that complicates that idea, without suggesting that the Dominican Republic is some kind of paradise either, but it certainly complicates kind of that trajectory. So what I'm interested in, works like this by Rita Indiana and by the other artists and writers who I just showed to you, are kind of how they represent in their works, right? How Dominican queer subjects have long employed quite skillfully what I call certain epistemologies and knowledges and strategies to negotiate the specific constraints that they experience in the Dominican public sphere. So they have for a very long time, they have in fact skillfully moved between public spaces as well as in the real family relations, workplaces, and different public spaces such and community and official spaces. Should I respond to?
Yeah.
I'll just respond to like the last part. Right now, it's about the risk of nostalgia, and I think it's absolutely right. When you try to recuperate these kind of local expressions, I do think there's sort of a risk of finding something, having a sort of nostalgia for like a purer form, a local form versus the global, right? And I think, including my own work, I tend a little bit in that direction. Maybe you're critiquing that, but I would at the same time, even though I recognize, there's a sort of romanticization of the local that you might always be moving to, and that can be problematic. I also don't think you can sort of disavow the importance of looking at the local, because otherwise you just basically let more globalized ideas and scripts just take over and just assume that they represent, not only the North but the South. So even if the local is a really fraught concept that gets really tricky in these, particularly in the Caribbean, that never has been purely local since Columbus arrived, and it's really, I'm not sure you can let go of the idea of differentiating between sort of more dominant global scripts and the local, but with always a caveat. You might end up romanticizing, or also just difference as, the Southern difference. So I think it's a very tricky. I think that might be the main challenge. I think that people try to think through this in the region are facing. Like, what do you do with these local expressions without suggesting they're, better, or more romantic, more powerful, or any of these things. And the other thing, I also think, you are pointing to problematizing the use of queer a little bit, because queer has become a kind of globalized thing too. Maybe not quite in the way as LGBT, but it certainly has gotten tacked on to LGBT, so it's LGBTQ very often. So it's tricky. In U.S. scholarship, it still has, I think it still marks a certain difference from an earlier moment in LGBT studies, but of course in other places in the world, academia has not necessarily followed this path, like, now we have LGBT studies, now let's move to queer studies, and now we add the Q necessarily. So in some ways, what I did in my talk is definitely marked by my presence in U.S. academia, where I hold on to queer as a sort of more open category that will be useful for me to talk about sexualities that I don't want to name as lesbian or gay, right? So I use it as a conceptual shorthand. All the while, there are lots of people, including myself, suggesting that movement of queer is just another globalized sort of, imposition of a globalized category and understanding, even if it's not exactly the same as LGBT, right? So in some ways, my use of queer in my work is I use it in part to make myself legible in U.S. academia, which, right, admittedly is one of my main audiences. I do present my work in the Dominican Republic, and I'm more cautious. Queer means differently in the Dominican Republic than in the U.S. It means a lot more in the U.S. than when I, give a talk in Santo Domingo. So that's a point I'm taking. And I might have to cite you on your interpretation of Rita Indiana's video, because I like that a lot. The kind of the desert scene and how that complicates the understanding of home. I think that's a point well taken, which also complicates a little bit my point about how she's like arguing going home, perhaps more sincerely. You're reading it more kitschy and perhaps more critically than I was reading it more as like a real sort of, jolly, let's all go home kind of message, which might not agree. It was written at a moment when she herself was returning to Santo Domingo, so I think there was like a sincere part about it, but I also think that the video, the visual kind of aesthetics really disavow that celebratory notion of returning home, right? At least complicated. So,
Could it be also that there's another element in Rita Indiana's decision, which is purely commercial? It sells, right? Nostalgia sells. This is a commercial enterprise. She's trying to make as much money or have as much visibility. I mean, this is commercial culture. This is not a high art abstracted from the market, right? So that's because the other thing, if she was not queer, if she was not gay, what would have been different? I mean, can someone, since we have multiple identities, right? She's gay, she's Dominican. Can she behave as a Dominican entrepreneur? That's another identity. And gayness at that moment is not.
I mean, I would argue that her lyrics in general appeal very strongly to sort of a popular Dominican way of talking. They're deliberately use a very colloquial, she writes them colloquial, it's very colloquial. Right. I think that could be a kind of commercial popular, like she wants that widespread appeal, and it was successful. I think the video itself, the aesthetics, I'm not sure that's the most mainstream Dominican aesthetic. Like if you look at how other musicians sell themselves in the Dominican Republic, it's a very different aesthetic. Like how that has nothing to do with that. So I do think there is like a more radical project, and that's just make a lot of money. I would argue, at least from how the videos look, she's not a typical Dominican musician in a way.
But it could be also simply more cosmopolitan and modern, right? Rather than some merengueros going like that, and which is the pop.
Yeah.
Right.
And I would, in other parts of the book, what I look at, there is an embrace by these artists of the cosmopolitan that is not an embrace of sort of market culture, but a more sort of high art kind of cosmopolitanism, and that is important to them to differentiate themselves from a certain dominant national sphere, right? So that's what I'm saying. They're not purely saying, oh, it's just all merengue and local. No, they actually embrace certain parts of cosmopolitan culture. It's just not necessarily mass culture. It's not McDonald's. It's not your certain stereotypes of globalized culture. But I mean, in terms of the whole. Yeah. Exactly. But in terms of the terminology, I would just say it's incredibly tricky because these people, not all people in my project some of them are heterosexual and they write or create works that are about same-sex desire. So the identities of these people in this project it also change. Some people would, I would personally call some bisexual, some are straight, heterosexual, some are gay or lesbian, and then what they call themselves, it also changes over time. Rita Indiana herself, there was only a certain moment, and I think around 2003, that she would use the term lesbian, and she didn't necessarily before. So it's really tricky also to see, is she gay or queer? I just use queer as a lazy shorthand to say, here are people who talk about same-sex desire in an interesting way. That's my lazy way, rather than sort of differentiating between gay or queer.
I work on Afro-Caribbean religions, and I can definitely see there what you're talking about, native categories and the changes to that. Because in many countries, like in Haiti, in Cuba, the space, the sort of the religious community, whether Lukumi or Voodoo, was the place where people of alternate sexualities and gender identities could actually just simply exist and find a place within them. They had categories. In Haiti, Masisi; in Cuba, Adodi. And so from a place of where they were in a way accepted and were able to, let's say, perform their sexualities and gender identities, now they're through the globalization of queer identity, so they're pushing back within their communities. Okay, you let me function here, but you are only, let's say, in terms of dress, you're only recognizing the gender I was assigned at birth. Let me wear skirts instead of pants. So there's a pushback, a constant negotiation between what was once an acceptable place and is no longer acceptable through globalization. So
And there are certainly people who agree with what you're saying. There are different scholars like Roberto Strongman and some others. Mark Padilla writes about Dominican Republic, but there are certain pushbacks when LGBT becomes globalized that makes things worse in some ways. Like there is a sort of, more outright rejection of what's associated with like queer or gay or lesbian, and it can have like sort of a negative backlash. But it's really tricky. I mean, how do we evaluate?
Because it's associated with foreigners or an imposition imperialistic, something like that. Is that?
In Cuba, at least that's definitely the case. Like Aisha Belizo de Jesus just wrote a book recently precisely about that, how now they're identifying queerness with all these Westerners that come get initiated in Cuba.
In sub-Saharan Africa,
Yeah.
Nigeria and all of these places, I mean, gay movements have been associated with the imposition of Europeans and North Americans.
But at the same time, that's where that used to be my perspective, and I shifted. The more I see local LGBT organizations forming, the less I feel like I'm willing to dismiss all that as sort of, some form of false consciousness. Like, so if they're local organizations, to sort of dismiss that's all global and foreign, also seems not right, or so to just I think the whole local global kind of bind, has complicated itself a lot. The more LGBT organizations that you have that are locally formed, you're going to say you're just a global imposition. That seems really unfair.
No, I'm saying there is. I'm saying
No, I
it's
know.
seen as
I've seen that too.
Just to clarify, you said you were using the term queer as kind of an overarching idea of sexual minorities. Are you also including gender minorities there as well? Because you did mention transgender people, but I wasn't sure.
Yes.
Okay.
I in the larger project, yes, there are works that speak, particularly in Wadis Hakaz's work, it's a lot about, that would be the chap that most talks about it, and he really often makes them his protagonists, and he finds a way, and that's what I'm really interested in, how he finds a way to make these characters that seem like a lot of people think with troubled Dominican audience, the most likable and the kind of character that then audience most identify with. He has different plays where it's really remarkable how through humor and like different ways, like he doesn't ask people to identify with these characters that might seem really other or different, but he sort of asks them to relate to them through other experience that they have. So it's migration or poverty. So there's like a really interesting work with identification where he says, there's not a person saying, I am this way and you have to accept me. It's more like, I'm this person, here I am, and I have these experiences, and these experiences are actually related to what a lot of other Dominicans or people in the audience relate. And there's a way through humor and emphasizing these shared experiences that he's able to really put these center stage, and he's been doing that, since the early 90s. And it's most very, very successfully. And then there are people in the Dominican news who are like, wow, we're really surprised that people like his works, because they shouldn't. Like, according to what you think about sort of Dominican norms, there should be like, nah, there's, prostitutes, pimps, travestis. People should not identify with these characters, but they do. So that's kind of what I'm interested in. Well, how does he do that? How does he make people like these and want to see that and pay for it and support that?
The last thing that I wanted to say, I was going to be the first. This idea that you said that when you talk to other scholars, you feel that your topic, you feel more kinship, or that there is more in common with the rest of Latin America than with the rest of the Caribbean. And I would say that is true in general in terms of culture, literature, origins, religion, politics, mostly formal stuff. But if there is one thing that actually the Hispanic Caribbean may have more in common with the rest of the Caribbean rather than with the rest of Latin America, maybe attitudes and practices over sexuality and sensuality, including homoeroticism, at the popular level, as popular attitudes and popular behaviors, right? That may be something to explore, because if there is one thing that may, because of probably the West African connection, right?
Yeah, it goes a little bit in the direction of what you're saying, right?
I mean, he was saying about religion, but beyond religion.
And there are people, there's a scholar who has suggested something along the same lines happening in the Dominican Republic. So I think, I mean, there is a way. There's people who work on sort of Afro-Caribbean spiritual practices and who point to a certain sexual fluidity that might then be something particular to the Caribbean. But then, as you said, there are interesting things happening as sort of LGBT kind of discourse more popular, where there's a certain, might be a certain pushback to that. And so, I mean, I don't know as much about the DR. Like, I think it might be easier to look at Cuba. I'm sure there are ways that you can look. And okay, one thing I can add, Rita Indiana draws heavily on sort of Afro-Dominican spiritual practices. That's like her thing. It's called, she wears like an M, that's for Los Misterios. And there are other kind of references in her work, not so much in this one, but definitely in others, where she very heavily sort of informs her work by different Afro-Dominican spiritual practices and emphasizes it very much. It's really important to her. So I think that really speaks to, you know, what you're saying.
She mentions Bembe there. That's actually an Afro-Cuban practice of the drumming, the ritual drumming in the song.
Yeah, she also, I think she's an initiate of Santeria, so she, in the recent years, so she also draws, you know, from not only from the kind of Dominican practices.
Oh, but that's very common, and it goes beyond sexuality. I mean, Cuba received like 800,000 slaves in the 19th century, very recent, until the 1850s. So African culture is much more visible and strong in Cuba than it is in the Dominican Republic of Puerto Rico, where it's more of mulatto culture, right? It has been mixed for ages. There is nothing comparable to the awareness of Igbos and Yorubas and, you know, all of these African ethnicities in the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. So that may be more generic. But the question of sexuality and sexual behaviors and attitudes, and including sexual categories, it's beyond religion. It's beyond Afro-Caribbean religions. It's even people who maybe ethnographers. I don't know.
I teach a course. I have a seminar on Caribbean sexualities where we compare, and it's very tricky. Yeah, there's some overlaps that are interesting, but there are also vast differences. And whether you're in the Anglophone Caribbean and you have Protestant religion and institutions, matters greatly, and there's huge differences. So, but yes, I mean there are.
Oh my God! Oh, we're making count.
Anyway, thank you.
Oh, thanks a lot. It was fascinating.